War defines civilizations. But what happens to a people when war is not a season but a way of being? The answer is the Mandalorians, a culture of armor and oaths, whose presence would shape galactic history for thousands of years. Even when their banners vanished from the skies, the story of the Mandalorians does not begin with shining Republic capitals or cloaked Jedi meditating on the light side of the Force. It begins with exiles and survivors under a harsh sun, in an age before the Republic's maps were complete, when the Jedi and the Sith were still struggling to understand the dark side and the light side. A warrior species called the Taung drifted across the stars, driven by ancient conflict and defeat. They were tall, fierce, and relentless, forged by loss and hunger. Over time, their wandering brought them to a world that would define them, a world they conquered and renamed Mandalore. What they found there would change everything. Endless deserts, shattered canyons, and predators that turned battle into a test of faith. Most tales of power in this galaxy follow empires and orders, the rise of the Sith, the vigilance of the Jedi. But what remains when the temples fall and the thrones are empty? What endures when the Force-bearers step aside? In the quiet spaces between those great struggles, a different tradition moved in armor and in whispers. The Mandalorians, a people who turned survival into ritual and made war a language more enduring than flags or governments. This is the story of warriors who began as non-human conquerors and slowly opened their ranks to humans and others, until Mandalorian stopped meaning a species and began to mean a creed. Tonight, the path will run from the first Taung champions on Mandalore, through crusades that burned across the Outer Rim, through the Mandalorian Wars against the Old Republic, when figures like Mandalore the Ultimate challenged the Jedi and drew Revan to Malachor V, and through the quiet aftermath when helmets lay abandoned in the dust. Over time, Mandalore itself would change from a world of endless campaigns to a pacifist, neutral society under Duchess Satine Kryze. The new Mandalorians tried to bury the old ways, even as Death Watch and darker powers waited in the shadows. The Darksaber, forged long ago by Tare Vizsla, the first Mandalorian Jedi, passed from hand to hand, tracing a blood-stained line through Clone Wars' Imperial conquest and the Great Purge, the night of 1,000 tears that shattered cities and clans alike. What followed was not extinction, but scattering for the next 1,000 years. In legend and in reality, Mandalorians would survive as hidden covert cells, wandering mercenaries and quiet foundling tribes from the age of the Empire to the fragile New Republic. Their armor remained an echo of a forgotten chorus. This calm chronicle will move slowly through those ages, step by step. There is no need to remember every name or date, only to let the rise and fall of a warrior people become a distant, steady drumbeat as sleep begins to close in. From legends to lullaby, how Mandalorians shaped the galaxy. In the great tapestry of galactic history, Mandalorians move not as a single bright thread, but as a pattern that appears, fades, and returns. Power rises and falls around them. The Force surges in Jedi and Sith. Yet again and again, a simple T-shaped visor reappears at the edges of great events. Tens of thousands of years before the Battle of Yavin, before the Clone Wars, before the Empire, there were the Taung. On distant battlefields, they forged a harsh creed, and under a leader remembered as Mandalore I, they seized a world and gave it a name: Mandalore. What followed was an age of conquest. Their armor was not yet the gleaming Beskar of legend, but their reputation for relentless war was already spreading through the stars. Around 4,000 years before Yavin, Mandalorian crusaders collided with the Old Republic. This was the era of the Mandalorian Wars, when a warlord called Mandalore the Ultimate pushed his people into open conflict with the Republic's fleets. The Jedi hesitated, divided between caution and duty. Then a single Jedi Knight, Revan, chose to intervene. The battles at places such as Malachor V shattered fleets and scarred worlds, and the story of Mandalore became entangled forever with the story of the Sith and the Jedi. Over time, that brutal legacy forced Mandalorians to change. Repeated defeats, internal schisms, and the pressure of a growing republic pushed many clans away from endless crusade. By the era, only a few decades before the Clone Wars, a new vision emerged on Mandalore itself. Under Duchess Satine Kryze, the so-called New Mandalorians turned toward pacifism, building gleaming domed cities and declaring neutrality, while the galactic powers armed for another war. Yet a culture built on armor and creed does not abandon conflict easily. On Mandalore's moons and in its shadows, Deathwatch kept the old ways alive. Their alliance with Darth Maul on the Shadow Collective would shape the final years of the Republic. The Darksaber, forged long ago by the first Mandalorian Jedi, Tara Vizsla, passed from hand to hand as governments fell. Behind familiar images of clone troopers and Jedi generals, there was often a Mandalorian blade deciding who ruled a world. During the Dark Age of the Galactic Empire, Mandalore suffered again. The Great Purge, remembered as the Night of 1,000 Tears, turned cities to glass and scattered survivors across the Outer Rim. Unlike the Sith or the Jedi, Mandalorians were not bound together by the Force, but by shared armor, old songs, and whispered rules called the Way. That made their endurance fragile, yet strangely resilient. Small, covert cells, hidden foundlings, and quiet clans carried the creed forward into the New Republic era, even as most of the galaxy assumed Mandalore was dead. For thousands of years, from ancient crusades to lonely helmets abandoned in the sand, their presence has been a quiet undercurrent beneath larger struggles between dark side and light side. Behind ruined temples, forgotten treaties, and nameless battlefields, there is often a lost clan, a broken sigil, or the faint memory of the Darksaber's glow, waiting for history to notice it again. Before the helmet, the Taung and the first warriors of Shadow, but long before lonely helmets rusted in the sand, before the word Mandalorian meant anything at all, there was another people standing in the dark. The story of these first warriors does not begin on a harsh frontier world, but on a place more familiar, Coruscant, not the gleaming ecumenopolis of the Republic, but a primordial world of storms and volcanic ash, where the sky was choked and the ground shook with constant conflict. In that age, beneath a dim, clouded sun, the Taung walked. The Taung were tall, grey-skinned beings with long, almost skull-like faces and corded muscle, built for endurance. Their eyes peered through smoke and dust, their lungs adapted to a world that seemed determined to kill them. Around them, early humans struggled to survive the same brutal landscape. On this ancient Coruscant, the divide between predator and prey shifted with every storm. In this pressure, Taung culture hardened into something singular. Honor was not an abstract virtue, but a daily practice, measured in scars, oaths, and the willingness to stand one step closer to danger than anyone else. They revered war as a proving ground where the weak fell away and the worthy rose. Ritual combat marked their seasons, their leadership, even their faith. Over time, they came to believe that only through conflict could a being truly know its place. They named themselves Warriors of Shadow, striking from smoke and ruin, their armor and masks turning them into living symbols of endurance. Victory was sacred, but so was the courage to face certain defeat. In these early codes and creeds, the seeds of what would shape Mandalorian identity were already present, long before that name existed, long before the galactic stage knew their descendants. Yet even a people born to struggle can be outnumbered. As millennia passed, human populations on Coruscant swelled. The battles between Taung and humans grew from skirmishes into sustained war. Legends speak of a cataclysmic event, a great shroud of ash that darkened the world and turned day to twilight. In the chaos that followed was a final series of campaigns that broke Taung power on their ancestral home. Driven from the planet they had fought to define, the Taung became exiles among the stars. Their displacement carved a new wound into their mythology, guided by omens in the sky, by visions of worlds wreathed in storms. Their leaders promised that somewhere there was a place harsh enough to test them again. Only those strong enough to endure the journey would deserve it. Proto-myths speak of warlords and prophets, of commanders who read meaning in the patterns of distant nebulae and in the silhouettes of enemy fleets. For the next 1,000 years, their wandering became a crucible, turning loss into doctrine, and doctrine into destiny. They followed battle, chased rumor, and measured every new world against an ideal they had not yet seen. One day, they would find a planet that did not yield easily, a world of beasts, iron, and endless trial. What they found there would change everything. It would earn a new name, and that name would echo for thousands of years. Mandalore. Claiming a harsh world, Mandalore the First, and a planet of warriors. Mandalore was not a gentle answer to the Taung's long search. It was a challenge. Power in this place would not be granted by blood or by the Force, but by endurance, by the simple refusal to break. At the head of this wandering warrior, people stood a single figure, Mandalore the First. The story of this leader begins not with a throne, but with exile and hunger. Driven from their ancient battles and cut off from the great galactic powers, the Taung followed Mandalore into the unknown. When their ships finally descended on this remote world, what they found there would change everything. It was not a lush refuge. It was a proving ground. The planet that would bear his name was harsh, even by war-torn standards. Vast deserts of red and grey stretched between jagged mountain ranges. Storms swept across the plains with sudden, cutting violence. Beneath the crust lay veins of an impossibly dense metal that would shape their destiny. Beskar. In time, this iron would be forged into armor that could resist blaster fire and stand against the burning edge of a lightsaber, a quiet defiance against both Jedi and Sith. Above ground, the land crawled with predators and towering beasts, each one a reminder that survival here was never guaranteed. From the moment the Taung set foot on this world, conflict followed. Mandalore the First led campaigns not against empires or fleets, but against the planet itself and the creatures that ruled it. Among these, the most feared were the Mythosaurs, colossal reptiles whose massive forms darkened the horizon and churned the soil beneath their feet. Hunting them was less a strategy than a declaration. To face such a creature was to stand before extinction and refuse to step aside. What followed was a brutal, methodical war against Mandalore's native life. One by one, the great beasts fell. In the end, the Taung carved their triumph into bone and iron. The stylized skull of the Mythosaur, once a symbol of terror, became a sigil of dominance worn on banners, armor, and fortresses. Over time, that skull came to stand for something larger than a single victory. It was the emblem of a people who had taken a murderous world and forced it to acknowledge them. In the wake of these conquests, Mandalore the First did more than survive. He renamed the very world in his image. Mandalore became both planet and person, and then something else, a title. Future warlords, clan heads, and conquerors would claim the mantle of Mandalore, tying their authority to that first act of planetary conquest. For the next 1,000 years and beyond, bearing that name meant carrying the weight of an entire culture's expectations. Slowly, a creed emerged from dust, blood, and Beskar. To be Mandalorian was no longer a matter of species. The Taung themselves would fade, but the culture endured. What mattered was the willingness to fight, to endure harshness without flinching, and to seize a place in a galaxy that often had no room for them. This identity, born on a world of storms and skeletons, would echo into future wars, drawing new peoples into its orbit and turning a single world into the heart of a much wider legacy. From species to creed, how Mandalorians became more than Taung as Mandalore's storms raged on and the bones of conquered beasts whitened in the open air, the Taung faced a quiet problem power alone could not solve. Their numbers were finite, their wars were costly, and the galaxy beyond their homeworld was vast. How could a single warrior species hold what it had taken and still hunger for more? The answer was simple and ruthless. They would become more than a species over time, as Taung warbands pushed beyond Mandalore into nearby systems. Their campaigns brought them into constant contact with other peoples. Some were broken and enslaved, driven to Minor, or build fortresses. Others were tested in the arena and on the battlefield, and those who survived impressed their captors in a culture where strength and resolve were the highest currency. Even an enemy could become something else. What followed was a slow transformation, hidden beneath the thunder of war. At first, these recruits were expendable shock troops thrown into the worst fighting while the Taung held command. But the logic of conquest did not stop there. If a warrior fought with the ferocity of a Mandalorian bore armor scarred by a dozen campaigns and obeyed the codes of command and challenge, then a question emerged. Did blood truly matter, or did the creed matter more? The story of the Mandalorians shifted from the tale of one ancient people to a growing martial brotherhood in which helmets concealed species and past lives equally. Mandalorian came to mean a way of being not a face beneath the visor loyalty to the Mandalore unflinching courage in the face of impossible odds, and a willingness to live and die in armor would shape who was accepted far more than origin or homeworld. This change crystallized in the rise of clans and houses, great banners under which many bloodlines could gather. A clan might begin as a single Taung family, but over generations it absorbed promising warriors from conquered worlds. Former enemies whose skill had earned respect were offered a choice: remain prisoners or swear. The Resol'nare, the core obligations of Mandalorian life. Those who chose the creed were given a new name, a new sigil, and a place at the fire. In this way, Mandalorian clans became flexible living structures, expanding and contracting with each campaign. A house could span species and continents, its members united by shared battles and shared armor, rather than shared ancestry. This inclusiveness was harsh. There was no room for weakness, no tolerance for betrayal. Yet it ensured that even as the original Taung dwindled, their ideals did not vanish. Their image persisted in the discipline of human warriors, in the tactics of alien shock troops, in the unbroken line of those who called themselves sons and daughters of Mandalore. The Taung themselves faded into legend, their features blurred by time until few remembered that Mandalorians had ever been anything else. But their solution to extinction endured a creed that could be taught and a culture that could be worn. Then a quieter image emerges, a pattern interrupt in the roar of galactic history. Imagine a long, silent hall. Deep beneath a fortress on Mandalore, rows of armor stand stretched into the darkness, each suit a different shape. Broad-shouldered for a Taung compact and angular, for a human elongated, for a tall alien with digitigrade legs. Some helmets bear narrow visors, others wide T-shaped slits. Some are painted in mourning black, others in the bright colors of personal vows. Yet every chest plate carries the same sigil, the same Mythosaur skull, the same silent declaration. Mandalorian in that stillness. The meaning of the word becomes clear. It is not a species, it is a promise. This understanding would echo into future eras when new wars and new leaders would again test what it meant to belong to Mandalore and to the ancient way that refused to die. The rise of the Crusaders, early Mandalorian expansion. From that promise, a new phase began, the age when Mandalorians stopped measuring themselves only against each other and turned their gaze toward the stars. Power had to be tested, but what happens when an entire culture believes the only true measure is war? The answer is the rise of the Mandalorian Crusaders. Over time, the scattered clans hardened into organized warbands, each led by champions who traced their honor back to Mandalore the First. These were not aimless raiders. They were disciplined formations of Taung and adopted humans bound by oath and armor. They mapped nearby systems from the Mandalore sector, charted hyperspace lanes, and marked every neighboring world with a single question: was it worthy prey? As these crusaders formed, their armor changed as well. What had once been practical plates, beaten into shape in clan forges, became a codified image that would shape galactic memory of Mandalorian's tea. Shaped visors, narrowed into unblinking masks, segmented cuirasses and pauldrons, locked together in overlapping fields of protection, and every warrior carved or painted personal signs onto the metal clan sigils. Kill tallies and subtle colors of private vows turned each suit into a quiet record of conflict and survival around these early campaigns. The Mandalorians pushed first into nearby mid-rim systems, striking at worlds that lacked strong Jedi or Republic presence. What followed was a relentless pattern of open battle and siege warfare. They favored clear declarations of intent, orbital bombardments to break defenses, and then methodical assaults on fortress cities. Captured, populations were divided, some taken as slaves to fuel Mandalorian industry. Others, absorbed as foundlings into clans, their strongest enemies often rose from chains to wear helmets of their own. To outside observers, this expansion resembled conquest for its own sake. But within the culture, a more austere belief was forming. War itself became a sacred trial. The story of the Mandalorian Crusaders is not simply one of plunder. It is a theology of combat in which peace is treated not as an achievement, but as an interval between necessary tests of strength when there were no worthy foes nearby warbands. Turned on dangerous fauna, on each other, or on the harsh wilderness of Mandalore, anything to keep the edge from dulling. During this era, their reputation began to spread. Traders whispered of armored hosts, whose banners bore the Mythosaur skull, whose leaders spoke of honor, even as they demanded tribute. Republic scouts logged these reports, but the core worlds remained distant abstractions to most Crusaders. They wanted resistance, they wanted fortresses that could answer fire with fire, and champions who could meet them blade to blade over time. That hunger pushed their gaze farther along the hyperlaners toward richer targets and stranger rumors. Stories of worlds where the Force was wielded openly of warrior monks who served an ancient order. Questions emerged in Mandalorian war councils: who were these Jedi? And what kind of trial could such opponents offer? The answer to that question would change everything. And the first shadows of truly legendary wars began to gather at the edge of the map. Clans, houses, and honor, building the Mandalorian social order. Those first questions about the Jedi did not rise from a single mind. They emerged from a people already trained to think in terms of bonds and rivalries. Mandalorian power did not begin with empires or fleets. It began with the smallest unit, a single armored warrior sworn to a name and a cause. From there, it expanded outward in careful layers. Family bloodlines formed the core, then extended into broader kin groups called clans, and above the clans stood mighty houses whose influence could stretch across systems over time. This layered structure became the quiet engine of Mandalorian history. A child born under one roof might grow to fight beside distant cousins on another world, yet both would carry the same sigil on their armor. That sigil was more than decoration. It was a public promise of loyalty and an open challenge to enemies. Ancient Taung warbands on Mandalore the First's frontier, and later human recruits under his successors, all moved within this web of obligation and pride. Clans competed, constantly skirmishing over resources, honor, and reputation. A victory in a minor border conflict could elevate a name for generations. A single act of cowardice could stain it just as long. But above this restless motion hovered a singular possibility. The rise of a Mandalore was not merely a title, it was a verdict delivered by war. When one leader's strength and battlefield vision became undeniable, the clans would bend the knee, not out of submission but recognition. In different eras, that recognition took many forms. Some Mandalores forged unity by leading crusades against the Republic, others by defending Mandalorian space against outside threats, yet the pattern remained the same. Scattered houses drawn together under one helm, then scattered again when that helm finally fell. What followed was a repeating rhythm of consolidation and fracture, a rhythm that would shape encounters with Jedi and Sith. Alike, for thousands of years beneath all of this ran a strict concept of honor. Mandalorians did not worship the dark side or the light side, but they treated a kept promise as sacred loyalty. To clan and house outweighed personal comfort and survival. A word given before witnesses bound warrior to warlord and warlord to warrior. Betrayal was not an abstract moral failing. It was a practical crime answered with exile blood price, or a blaster shot delivered without hesitation. This harsh code created constant internal conflict. Yet it also ensured that when an external threat appeared, the same warriors who had raided each other's holdings could close ranks in an instant. A house feud might pause the moment a greater enemy crossed the border. The story of Mandalorian society is the story of this tension between rivalry and unity, between the urge to test one another and the need to stand together, and when a Mandalore arose strong enough to command not just fear but genuine allegiance, the entire galactic balance trembled. For the next 1,000 years, those rare moments of true unity would send armored legions toward the very Jedi whose existence had once been only a rumor. And the first of those Mandalore was about to step out of legend and onto a much wider stage. Beskar and the Forge, the metal that defied the Jedi. With that first Mandalore stepping onto the wider galactic stage, the Mandalorians carried more than tactics and fearsome reputations into battle. They carried a metal that would shape every encounter with the Jedi who opposed them. This was Beskar Mandalorian iron, a rare, dense ore buried deep in Mandalore's crust, and on a few scattered moons, a substance so resilient that blaster bolts scorched it without piercing, and even a Jedi lightsaber struggled to carve more than a glowing furrow across its surface. Over time, this metal became the quiet answer to a very loud question. How could ordinary flesh and blood warriors stand against beings who bent the Force itself to their will? The answer was not sorcery or the dark side, but metallurgy. Mandalorian prospectors learned to read the planet's seismic rhythms, mining Beskar from veins twisted by ancient cataclysms. What they found there would change everything, because once refined and tempered, Beskar did not simply resist heat and impact, it remembered every blow and grew stronger when reforged in hidden forges beneath Beskar domes and mountain redoubts. Mandalorian smiths transformed raw ingots into armor and weapons. The process was slow, ritualized, and intensely guarded flames were tuned to precise hues. Bellows moved in steady cycles, and each strike of the hammer followed patterns passed down for thousands of years. This was not mere craftsmanship, it was the story of a people, written in metal helms crested with T-shaped visors, gauntlets fitted for grapples and blades, and chest plates calibrated to disperse kinetic force. All emerged from that glowing heart of the Forge. These creations were more than equipment. Each piece of Beskar carried lineage. A pauldron might once have been a chestplate worn by an ancestor who fell on a distant battlefield. A vambrace could be reforged from a damaged helmet, reclaimed from the ruins of a lost clan hall. What followed was a cycle of loss and recovery. Armor shattered in war was gathered, recast, and returned to service, so that ancestors marched again in the plates of their descendants. In this way, inheritance became literal metal proof of worth earned through conflict and reclaimed through struggle. There was also a quieter power at work, a psychological edge. Few other warriors possessed the sight of a Mandalorian standing unmoving as a Jedi's lightsaber crashed against Beskar, created a new kind of fear and a new kind of faith. That bright blade, the symbol of the light side, met a surface that did not yield easily. In that moment, the Force itself seemed less inevitable, less absolute. And for Mandalorians, that defiance became a creed, hammered into every plate. Now the pace of history slows. The galactic war cries fade. Imagine a dim forge lit only by coals and molten metal. The outside world, distant and muffled there. The rhythmic ringing of a hammer falls in measured intervals. Each impact a heartbeat in Mandalorian history, each echo carrying the memory of sieges, crusades, and quiet oaths sworn in the glow of the anvil. In that sound, Beskar is not just protection, it is identity, resilience, and the promise that even when empires rise and fall, the metal endures, and the warriors who wear it are never entirely gone. First shadows of the Jedi, early encounters, and growing rivalry over time. That ringing of metal against metal drew the attention of distant stars. The Mandalorian crusades, which had once burned through remote and forgotten sectors, began to press against the borders of the Republic. At first, the Senate heard only scattered reports, lost colonies, raided trade routes, disrupted outposts gone silent. But as the years passed, those reports formed a pattern. A disciplined warrior culture was moving steadily toward the galactic core, and what followed was a slow awakening. By the time Mandalorian raiders struck worlds with formal representation on Coruscant, the Republic could no longer dismiss them as localized trouble governors, petitioned for aid, trade guilds, demanded escorts. And behind all of that noise, the Jedi Council listened in silence. The story of this rivalry begins not with hatred, but with concern. Who were these armored warriors who fought without fear of death? And why did their banners appear system after system with such relentless precision? The first encounters between Mandalorian warbands and Republic defense fleets were brutal yet strangely impersonal. Mandalorians tested planetary shields, probed naval formations, and then withdrew. As soon as resistance stiffened, when Jedi finally arrived to reinforce those lines, the contrast became impossible to ignore robed figures moving with the force against ranks of armored soldiers advancing in perfect formation, the light side meeting a culture that revered conflict as a path to honor on worlds scarred by these early clashes. Witnesses spoke of Jedi deflecting blaster fire in calm, sweeping motions, only to be met by Mandalorians who adapted mid-battle snipers, shifted positions, jetpack units flanked from unexpected angles, heavy infantry advanced with overlapping fields of fire. The Mandalorians had studied military doctrine for generations. Now they began to study something new. Jedi over time captured holo recordings and battlefield observations were carried back to hidden forges and war rooms on Mandalore blacksmiths, and tacticians worked side by side. Beskar armor was adjusted to deflect or at least survive glancing blows, from a lightsaber gauntlets, gained grappling lines and magnetic clamps, to seize or disrupt elegant energy blades. Shields and wrist launchers were calibrated to break the rhythm of force-enhanced assaults. Every duel became data, every defeat a lesson for the Jedi. These opponents felt different from Sith. There was no obvious dark side corruption, no hunger for domination. Instead, there was a disciplined creed that treated the Jedi as the ultimate challenge knights, reported, facing enemies who refused to retreat, even when outmatched Mandalorians who saluted before charging a final time for many Jedi. This was unsettling. It was easier to confront hatred than to confront respect, sharpened into a weapon for Mandalorians. The emergence of Jedi on the front lines confirmed something their ancestors had only whispered about. There existed warriors who could move starships with thought and turn aside blaster fire. With a gesture defeating such beings would shape legends for thousands of years. Children grew up hearing quiet stories of robed figures and hummingblades, and swore that one day they would stand against them. In this simmering tension, the Republic saw border conflicts and political risk. The Jedi sensed a gathering storm. The Mandalorians felt opportunity. None of them yet understood that these first shadows on the edge of known space were only the beginning. That one day Mandalore the Ultimate, a fallen Jedi named Revan, and a dead world called Malachor Fief would meet in a war whose echoes would still be felt in the age of empires and fallen orders. The Mandalorian Wars begin. Mandalore the Ultimate's Grand Crusade. In the gathering silence of the Outer Rim, the storm finally found its name. Mandalore the Ultimate, the latest in a long line of Mandalore. Yet unlike the wandering warlords before him, he carried a vision that stretched far beyond border raids and plunder. He believed the Mandalorians had grown soft, scattered and complacent, and that only a grand crusade against the greatest powers of the galaxy would shape them into something worthy of their ancient legends. Around 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, this Mandalore unified the fractious clans. Through brutal trials and stark promises, strength would be the only currency. Mercy, a forgotten word. The story of his rise was written in clan jewels and oaths sworn over Beskar armor when at last the banners of the great houses flew together under one command. He turned their gaze outward toward the Republic and the Jedi and announced a war that would test the entire galaxy. His opening moves were not wild charges, but careful incisions along the Outer Rim. He struck at worlds far from Coruscant, yet vital to trade and supply chains. Vanquo, Cathar, and other quiet systems suddenly found basilisk war droids screaming down through their skies. Mandalorian shock troops dropped from orbit in jetpack-led spearheads, burning through defenses before local forces could even send a distress call. What followed was a pattern of calculated terror and swift withdrawal. each assault daring the Republic to respond on Coruscant. The Senate hesitated, bound by procedure and haunted by the memory of earlier Sith wars. Some argued these were only border disputes. Others feared that overcommitting fleets would expose the core. The Jedi Council felt the disturbance in the Force, yet chose restraint. They believed the Mandalorians could be contained through limited support and diplomacy, rather than plunging the Order into another full-scale conflict. That reluctance created a quiet vacuum at the edge of galactic space, and Mandalore the Ultimate rushed in to fill it over time. His strategies grew bolder. Entire sectors fell under Mandalorian control. Key shipyards were seized, then turned to produce their own war machines. Basilisk war droids dove from orbit in coordinated packs, tearing through walkers and starfighters with savage precision. When resistance stiffened, Mandalorian fleets answered with orbital bombardments that glassed cityscapes and turned oceans to boiling storms. On Cathar, legend spoke of armored warriors driving an entire species into the sea, while their ships rained fire from above. The light side offered no rescue. There only the harsh calculus of conquest through all of this. Mandalore the Ultimate believed he was choosing each target to draw out the Republic and force the Jedi into open war. Yet in the shadows, another presence watched and whispered subtle suggestions, nudging him toward worlds heavy with dark side echoes and ancient battlefields that hungered for new blood. The Mandalorian Wars had begun on Mandalore's terms, but somewhere beyond his sight, a different will was arranging the pieces, and the next move would drag the Jedi Order into a catastrophe it was not prepared to face. Revan, the Jedi, and the trap at Malachor, 5. In that growing darkness, another figure stepped forward from the ranks of the Jedi. A young knight named Revan. Power corrupts, but what happens when that power is wielded in defiance of inaction? The answer in this war was Revan, and those who followed him called simply the Revanshists. They were Jedi who could no longer endure watching worlds burn while the Council debated around the midpoint of the Mandalorian Wars. Revan and his followers ignored the Council's orders and went to the front lines. The story of their intervention was swift and brutal. Revan studied Mandalorian strategies, learned their patterns, and began to turn their own aggression against them. Where Mandalorians favored direct planetary assaults, Revan responded with ambushes, precision strikes, and relentless pursuit. Entire campaigns shifted in months. Battles that had dragged on for years suddenly ended in decisive Republic victories, but what followed was not a clean triumph. It was an escalation. The Mandalorians pushed deeper into Republic space-burning worlds to draw Revan into open confrontation. In response, Revan adopted tactics that disturbed even his allies: orbital bombardments, psychological warfare, and calculated sacrifices of fleets and soldiers to lure Mandalorian crusaders into traps. Over time, the line between Jedi general and ruthless strategist blurred. The light side and the dark side mingled on those frontiers, and the Force felt heavier around him. The climax came at Malachor 5, a dead world on the edge of known space, steeped in ancient dark side echoes. Revan chose it as the stage for the final confrontation. He gathered the bulk of Mandalore the Ultimate's fleet and a massive Republic armada in one place. What they found there would change everything. Hidden among Revan's forces was a terrible weapon: the Mass Shadow Generator, a super weapon capable of twisting gravity itself around the planet. When the battle reached its peak, the device was activated in an instant space. Buckled, fleets were dragged from orbit and shattered against the surface. Ships tore apart under impossible stresses. Mandalorian cruisers and Republic capital ships fell together in silent arcs of fire. Malachor's crust cracked open and the world became a graveyard. The war's end was written in a single, catastrophic pulse that cared nothing for allegiance. Amid that destruction, Revan confronted Mandalore the Ultimate in single combat on the ruined surface. The duel was fierce, a collision of Beskar and blazing energy. Mandalore fought with the strength of his entire people behind him, but Revan's mastery of the Force and merciless precision prevailed when Mandalore fell. Revan stripped the mask from his broken body, ending his rule, and with it the unified command of the Mandalorians. That single act would shape their identity for thousands of years. In the aftermath, Mandalorian armor lay scattered across Malachor, and 100 other Dead World's banners burned in vacuum, and proud warships drifted as cold wreckage. A warrior culture that had once challenged the entire galactic order found itself broken, leaderless, and haunted by defeat. The clans would survive, but only as scattered remnants, their future uncertain, their past, a wound that refused to close. And in the silence after Malachor's scream, new shadows in the dark began to take notice. After the fall, broken clans and the long recovery in the stillness, after Malachor, the Mandalorians entered a different kind of battlefield. There were no roaring engines, no fleets trading fire across the void. Only the quiet struggle to endure defeat power had slipped from their grasp. But what happens when a warrior people lose not only a war, but the very purpose that bound them together? The answer is the slow unmaking of a culture and the long, uncertain path to something new in the immediate aftermath. The old hierarchy shattered Mandalore. The ultimate had fallen. The high war councils were dead or scattered, and with them, the fragile unity he had forced upon the clans. What followed was a return to fragmentation, but now without strength or direction. Entire lines of command vanished on Malachor Fethith. Banners were reduced to stories, and many surviving warriors found themselves not as conquerors, but as prisoners. Refugees and nameless veterans drifting at the edge of galactic. Society Revan understood this moment with a cold clarity after defeating Mandalore the Ultimate. Revan took his mask, the symbol through which Mandalorian authority flowed, for thousands of years. The mask had not been mere armor. It was the conduit of legitimacy, the object that allowed a single Mandalore to call the clans to war by hiding it. Revan severed that conduit. This was not mercy. It was strategic amputation without the mask. No new Mandalore could easily rise. No single banner could gather the scattered remnants into a unified threat again. Over time, this loss reshaped everything. Some clans tried to pretend nothing had changed. They clung to the old Crusader ways, raiding border worlds, clashing with Jedi patrols, and reenacting ancient glories on a smaller and more desperate scale. Others looked at the broken fleets and the dead on Malachor and began to ask whether endless conflict had doomed their people to slow extinction. They saw children growing up on half-ruined worlds or cramped stations learning to repair armor that would never again march in grand crusades across the Outer Rim. Mandalorians became a people in exile. Their Beskar still carried weight, but now it was a calling card for hired guns, not holy warriors. Many sold their skills as mercenaries, bodyguards, and bounty hunters. Their once grand campaigns collapsed into contracts and personal survival. A lone helmet at a cantina doorway, a quiet warrior guarding a hut palace, a small clan escorting freighters through pirate space. Each was a fragment of what had been an empire of battle, now reduced to individual lives, negotiating the margins of galactic power. Yet even in this diminished age, the story of the Mandalorians did not end. The memory of Mandalore, the Ultimate's crusade, remained a warning and a temptation. Some dreamed of finding the lost mask and restoring the old order. Others began to imagine something different, a Mandalore that might break the cycle of war entirely somewhere beyond the ruins and the mercenary contracts. A new vision waited to be claimed, and the next leader who reached for it would shape far more than the fate of a single world. From crusaders to mercenaries, Mandalorians in the Old Republic era, in the long shadow of Mandalore, the Ultimate's defeat. The warrior clans did not vanish. They adapted power once expressed through crusades and planetary sieges, began to flow through quieter channels. The galaxy remembered the terror of armored legions crossing the stars, but what followed was something more diffuse, and in some ways more enduring over time. Mandalorians became less an invading horde and more a scattered brotherhood of elite soldiers for hire. In the centuries after the Mandalorian Wars, shattered banners and broken fleets drifted into the Outer Rim without a single Mandalore to unite them. Many clans turned to mercenary work. War had always been their language. Now it became their livelihood. Planetary militias hired Mandalorian companies to stiffen weak lines. Crime syndicates paid them to enforce fragile empires of fear. Even minor planetary rulers in forgotten systems quietly retained a handful of armored warriors as personal guards. One Beskar helmet in a throne room could do what an army could not. It could end arguments before they began across the galactic frontier. Their presence became a rumor carried from port to port. In places the Republic barely mapped, Mandalorian armor still gleamed under harsh suns, sometimes painted in old clan colors, sometimes scarred and mismatched from generations of repair. These were no longer legions marching under a single banner, yet their reputation lingered. A single Mandalorian stepping off a transport in a lawless spaceport could silence a crowd. The memory of Jedi struggling against them on worlds like Diikshun and Malachor. 5 remained an unspoken warning. The story of this era was not one great war, but countless small conflicts that never reached the Senate floor on a mining moon in the Midi. Rim, a Mandalorian strike team, ended a labor revolt in a single night on a backwater agri-world. Another band chose the opposite path, defending settlers from raiders in exchange for food and shelter. These scattered campaigns kept their combat arts alive within cramped barracks and makeshift strongholds. Veterans taught foundlings the creed and the old tongue. A child taken in on Nar Shaddaa might grow up hearing tales of Mandalore I and Tara Vizsla told in a low voice over the sound of armor being repaired to the Republic and the Jedi Order. These warriors became dangerous remnants rather than an existential threat. Intelligence reports flagged their movements. Jedi watchmen in the Outer Rim were warned that a Mandalorian presence could escalate any local conflict. But there was no unified empire to confront, no single siege to break. Instead, the Jedi treated them as volatile elements in a fragile galactic equation, monitored, contained, but rarely engaged head-on unless the Force demanded it. Then the pace slows far from trade routes on a forgotten world. A small campfire burns against a dark sky. Armor plates rest in neat stacks. Beside it, an elder in weathered Beskar sits with a ring of children, their helmets still too large for them. The old warrior speaks softly of crusades and duels with Jedi, of a time when Mandalore's voice carried across the stars. The flames crackle, the night wind stirs, and for a moment the past feels close. This quiet circle would shape the future more than any contract signed in a distant city. Somewhere beyond that fire, a new vision of Mandalore waits for the next leader bold enough to claim it. A new vision, the rise of the new Mandalorians around this same era. While old warriors whispered around lonely campfires, another Mandalore was being born in steel and glass, not from crusades, but from exhaustion. For generations after the Mandalorian Wars, the clans turned their fury inward, with no Republic fleets to raid and no Jedi armies to... They would challenge rival houses, fought for scraps of power on a world already scarred. The deserts grew wider, cities fell into ruin, and the air itself carried the memory of fire over time. The constant civil war hollowed Mandalore from within. Entire regions became uninhabitable, pocked with glassed craters and silent battlefields where Beskar lay half buried in ash. Children grew up among wrecked walkers and shattered gunships. Their lullabies were artillery in the distance and the hiss of recycled air in underground shelters. The story of this age was not glorious conquest, but slow suffocation. A warrior culture consuming itself in this bleak landscape. A different answer emerged. The movement that would become the new Mandalorians asked a simple heretical question. What if survival required not better weapons, but fewer of them? Their leaders, many drawn from war widows, orphans and disillusioned officers, began to preach pacifism, neutrality and reconstruction. They spoke of Mandalore not as a forge for endless conflict, but as a wounded world in need of healing. What followed was a political and cultural revolt, fought more in council chambers than on open fields. Instead of new armor, they built new habitats. Instead of training children with rifles, they trained engineers, doctors, and negotiators. The new Mandalorians gathered support among those who had lost the most to war. And slowly, the old warrior houses found their influence slipping away, not to a rival clan, but to a new vision entirely. Eventually, the new Mandalorians seized the levers of power on Mandalore. They established a gleaming pacifist capital at Sundari, sealed beneath a vast dome on the planet's ravaged surface. There, weapons were restricted, armor was rare, and public life avoided any open celebration of the old crusades. Warrior clans who refused to disarm were pushed to the margins, exiled to distant moons or confined to monitored enclaves far from the new government's pristine corridors. The ideological shock was immense. For thousands of years, Mandalorians had been defined by armor and battle. Now the official face of Mandalore wore flowing robes instead of Beskar and spoke of peace. In the galactic Senate statues of ancient champions were removed or relocated. Museums reframed old campaigns as tragedies rather than triumphs. Even the Darksaber passed into legend as a dangerous symbol of a past best forgotten. Yet beneath the glass streets and quiet plazas, resentment smoldered for some. The attempt to erase the warrior spirit felt more dangerous than any siege. They believed that abandoning the old ways was a slow death, worse than defeat at the hands of Jedi or Sith. This fragile peace would shape the next chapter of Mandalorian history, and in the shadows, those who rejected it quietly prepared to test whether Mandalore could ever truly live without the armor that had once defined its soul. Duchess Satine and the dream of a peaceful Mandalore on a world built on armor and ash. The most radical act of power was to set the weapons down. The story of Mandalore in this era turns not on a warlord in iron, but on a woman in pale robes. Duchess Satine Kryze had walked through the fires of Mandalorian civil war as a young noble. The chaos of rival clans and foreign intervention carved a single conviction into her life, that the old cycle of conquest and revenge had to end, or Mandalore itself would die in the aftermath of those conflicts. Satine rose to lead a movement that called itself the New Mandalorians, where earlier generations had reshaped their bodies with armor. Her generation tried to reshape their spirit. They rebuilt the capital Sundari as a statement to the galaxy and to their own haunted memory. The city rose from the desert in sweeping curves of glass and white stone, sealed beneath a vast protective dome. There were no banners of conquered worlds, no trophies from fallen Jedi, or scythe-only clean lines, open plazas and quiet reflection pools, a deliberate rejection of the brutal past. From orbit, Sundari looked almost fragile, a pale jewel in a wasteland beneath that dome. Though the transformation went deeper than architecture, weapons were tightly regulated, warrior lodges were dissolved, and the government preached stability over glory over time. Even the sight of traditional armor inside the capital became rare. The domed city stood as a kind of sanctuary, a place where children learned Mandalorian history through art and philosophy, instead of combat drills and firing ranges. When the Clone Wars erupted across the Galactic Republic, Satine faced a test that would shape everything she had built. The galaxy again, divided into camps of power, the Republic on one side, the Separatist Alliance on the other. Both expected Mandalore to choose a banner. Satine refused. Her government declared strict neutrality. No clone armies garrisoned her world. No separatist droid legions marched through Sundari's pristine avenues. Mandalore would trade speak and negotiate, but it would not fight. This stance placed her in constant conflict with the currents of the age. Republic senators questioned her loyalty. Separatist agents whispered that neutrality hid secret alliances. Even within Mandalore, many traditionalists felt that something older and deeper was being smothered under white stone and glass. They remembered tales of Mandalore, the ultimate of crusaders who had challenged Jedi and Republic alike to them. The disarming of the clans felt less like peace and more like surrender, an attempt to erase the very identity that had endured for thousands of years beneath the calm surface of Sundari. Resentment pooled in hidden corners. Exiled warriors plotted on distant moons and in forgotten strongholds. What followed was a quiet polarization between those who believed Satine's dream was the only path to survival and those who believed that without armor, Mandalore had no soul. Her refusal to embrace the wider conflict did not shield her from the dark side of galactic politics it drew. Attention, ambitious men and patient enemies watched this pacifist duchess and her vulnerable, neutral world, and in the shadows, the first moves were already being made to test just how easily a domed city of glass could shatter. Deathwatch in the shadows. The return of the old ways. In the shadows of those glass-domed cities, another Mandalore was being remembered, whispered in campfires and hidden bunkers far from Sundari's polished streets. Power invites resistance, and on Mandalore that resistance did not come from off-worlders or Sith, but from Mandalorians who believed their own Duchess had betrayed their soul. The story of Deathwatch begins as a rejection, not only of Satine, but of the very idea that Mandalorians could ever truly abandon war for generations. Tales of ancient crusades had passed from elder to child stories of Taung warriors, of Mandalore the First, and of clans that had once challenged the Republic and even the Jedi Order over time. Those tales hardened into doctrine for a splinter faction that called itself Deathwatch. In their eyes, the new Mandalorians were an aberration. Mandalore was meant to be feared across the galactic rim, its people defined by armor Beskar and the will to fight. They saw pacifism as decay. At the center of this movement stood Pre Vizsla, scion of an old and storied house. His very name carried the weight of centuries and of an ancestor who had walked the halls of the Jedi Temple as Tare Vizsla, the first Mandalorian Jedi, where Satine wore silk and spoke of the light side. Pre Vizsla donned blue and grey armor, etched with the iconography of war. He moved through the shadows of Mandalore's moons as a commander, not a politician, and at his side rested a weapon whose true significance had not yet been revealed. A short, black-bladed lightsaber that hummed with an unsettling intensity. The Darksaber, what followed was a campaign of carefully measured terror. Not open war, but 1,000 cuts meant to bleed. Satine's regime, dry death. Watch operatives sabotaged transports, bombed infrastructure, and staged attacks that could be blamed on outside agitators. Each explosion was a message. Each collapsed tower, a reminder that beneath the neutral facade, Mandalore's old wounds had never fully healed. Their bases on Concordia and other outlying worlds became training grounds where recruits learned not diplomacy, but demolition. Yet beneath the detonations, the deeper conflict was cultural at its core. This was a struggle over what it truly meant to be Mandalorian. Were they now a people of peace, sheltered under domes and treaties, or a scattered warrior nation waiting to rise again? Deathwatch answered with a creed of strength and tradition. They claimed that only through conflict could Mandalore reclaim its destiny, that Satine's refusal to join the wider Clone Wars was not wisdom, but weakness in the quiet of their hidden camps. The tone changed. The armor came off the fires burned low, and the rhetoric softened there. New initiates listened as veterans recounted ancient sieges, battles against Jedi, and tales of Beskar that had turned aside lightsabers for thousands of years. One can almost hear the murmur of those stories drifting through cold air, promising honor, purpose, and a return to forgotten glory. This was the pattern that would shape Mandalore's future, not only in open battlefields, but in hearts slowly turned toward the promise of the old ways. And in the distance, other eyes were beginning to watch those flames with interest. Tare Vizsla and the birth of the Darksaber. In the quiet glow of those rekindled flames, another story waited, one that did not begin on Mandalore's scarred plains, but in the marble corridors of the Jedi Temple. The story of Tare Vizsla stood at the crossroads of two traditions that believed they understood power, yet feared at what the other represented. A warrior from a culture built on armor and fire, walking among robed guardians of the light side around 1,000. Years before the Clone Wars, the Jedi Order did something almost unthinkable. They accepted a Mandalorian child into their ranks. This child, Tare Vizsla, carried the weight of clans and crusades in his blood, yet he opened himself to the Force and to the discipline of the Jedi, where others saw only conflict between Beskar and serenity. Tare became a living bridge. His very existence would shape Mandalorian and Jedi history in ways neither side could yet imagine. Tare's weapon reflected that paradox in the heart of the Jedi Temple. He forged a blade that looked wrong among the elegant colors of traditional lightsabers. The Darksaber was shorter, more angular, its hilt shaped almost like a Mandalorian vibroblade, its edge a flat black silhouette outlined in pale white energy. When it ignited, it did not sing with the clear tone of other Jedi weapons. It hummed low and ancient, as if echoing from some earlier age of the Force. Each swing left a dark afterimage hanging in the air for a heartbeat. For the Jedi. It was an oddity for Mandalorians, it would become destiny. What followed was a life in which Tare Vizsla served the Order, yet never truly escaped the pull of his people. Legends whisper of him, mediating disputes, on Mandalore not with threats, but with calm authority. A Jedi who understood the language of honor duels and clan oaths. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history, not through a single battle but through the idea that Mandalorian strength and Jedi restraint did not have to exist as enemies after Tare's death. The Darksaber remained behind in the Jedi Temple, locked away among other relics of past conflicts to the Order. It was a curiosity, a reminder of an unusual night to House Vizsla. It was a stolen birthright over time, as tensions rose and fell between Mandalore and the Republic House. Vizsla struck when the galactic balance faltered. They infiltrated the temple and reclaimed the Black Blade, tearing it from the quiet archives back into the roar of Mandalorian war. Songs from that moment, the Darksaber was no longer merely a weapon. It was a claim whoever wielded it could claim the right to rule Mandalore, especially among House Vizsla. Its edge cut through more than armor. It cut through questions of legitimacy, passed from warrior to warrior. In duels and ceremonies, it became a portable throne, a crown of humming darkness, and what they found there would change everything. For the next 1,000 years, Mandalorians looked to that single blade as proof of destiny. Over time, the Darksaber's path began to mirror Mandalore itself, handed from conqueror to rebel, from traditionalist to reformer. Its presence heralded upheaval, its absence invited uncertainty, and in the shadows beyond Mandalore's skies, other powers, Jedi, Sith, and empires yet to rise, watched the black flame of that blade, knowing that wherever it appeared, history was about to turn. Maul, Vizsla, and the duel for Mandalore's soul. And in the Clone Wars, that turning came from beyond. Mandalore's own bloodlines, a reminder that power in the galaxy rarely respects borders or traditions when a world builds its identity on strength. What happens when an outsider arrives stronger still? The answer was Darth Maul in the middle years of the war, as the Republic and the Separatists bled each other across 1,000 fronts. Pre Vizsla saw an opening Satine's pacifist government kept Mandalore neutral, distant from Jedi and Sith, yet exposed to both the dark side and the light side. Through endless intrigue, Vizsla's Death Watch had failed through open rebellion, so he turned to a different weapon deception, and an exiled Sith Lord Maul emerged from the shadows with his Shadow Collective, a network of criminal syndicates, Black Sun, the Pikes, even the Hutt clans. This was not an empire in the traditional sense, but a web of fear and profit. What followed was a carefully staged descent into chaos. Mandalore's cities became a theater, and the Mandalorian people, the unwilling audience. Attacks erupted in the streets, bombings, raids, and kidnappings carried out by Maul's underworld soldiers. The images were clear armored figures terrorizing a world that had tried to forget war. Then, at the critical moment, Death Watch arrived, as saviors driving back the criminals they themselves had unleashed. Over time, the pattern repeated, just enough order restored to win trust, just enough terror preserved to keep that trust fragile in the eyes of many citizens. Satine's new Mandalorians had failed their promise of peace. Death Watch stepped forward as the only force willing to confront the dark openly. This orchestrated crisis allowed Vizsla to seize control, imprison Satine, and present himself as Mandalore reborn. But the story of this coup was never truly about his rule. It was about the ally he had invited into Mandalorian politics. Once Vizsla had power, Maul no longer needed the pretense the former Sith understood. Mandalorian custom enough to bend it, and he invoked an older law. Leadership by combat. Maul challenged Pre Vizsla before the assembled warriors of Death Watch. The terms were simple. The victor would claim command, and with it, the Darksaber itself. The duel that followed was brutal, yet strangely ritualistic. Armor against tattoos, Beskar against Horned Crown. Vizsla wielded the Darksaber with all the pride of Clan Vizsla. Maul answered with a red blade and decades of Sith training. But the true conflict was older than either of them. It was the question of whether Mandalore's authority came from bloodline culture or sheer power in the Force. When Maul finally disarmed Vizsla and took his head, the chamber fell silent. Then he reached down and lifted the Darksaber, an outsider. A former Sith now held the black blade that had once hung in the Jedi Temple. For thousands of years, it had symbolized Mandalorian leadership. Now it burned in the hand of a conqueror who was neither Mandalorian nor Jedi. Some clans knelt bound by tradition, others recoiled unable to accept that their fate had passed to a non-Mandalorian. By rite of combat, the world stood divided, uncertain, watching Maul's new regime take shape. And beyond Mandalore's storms, another figure was already moving through the Dark One, whose arrival would make this brief reign feel like only the beginning of civil war and occupation. Mandalore in the final days of the Republic, power changes a people. But what happens when that power is seized by an outsider who neither shares their blood nor their creed? The answer is the story of Mandalore under Maul, a brief reign that plunged an already fragile world into open war in the wake of his duel with Vizsla. Maul stood as Mandalore by ancient custom, yet custom could not command every heart. Some clans aligned with him, drawn to his ruthless strength and the promise of galactic influence through the Shadow Collective. Others recoiled at the thought that a former Sith apprentice, one who was not born of Mandalore, would shape their future. What followed was not unity, but fracture. In Sundari's pristine domes, the fracture became visible. Armored patrols bearing Maul's crimson markings clashed with blue and white loyalists in the avenues below. Gunships screamed between the elegant towers. Explosions shattered the illusion of new Mandalorian peace. Satine's dream of a neutral world was drowned beneath jetpack trails and blaster fire as brothers in arms turned their weapons on each other. In the streets they once swore to defend, at the center of this resistance stood Bo-Katan Kryze's Satine's sister, once a proud lieutenant of Death Watch. She had embraced the old warrior ways and helped Maul overthrow the pacifists, but there was a line even she would not cross accepting a non-Mandalorian, as Mandalore violated everything she believed. Over time, her disillusionment hardened into revolt. Breaking from Maul, she gathered those who refused his rule, forming an elite unit that would become known as the Night Owls, their armor marked by Sakau-stylized owl visors, their purpose simple: deny Maul uncontested control. As the Clone Wars neared their end, the conflict on Mandalore drew the attention of another fading power. The Republic Bo-Katan reached beyond Mandalore's storms, seeking aid from a former Jedi who had already walked away from the Order. Ahsoka Tano, her presence carried the weight of both the Jedi and the war that raged across the galaxy, together with a contingent of clone troopers led by Captain Rex. She returned at Bo-Katan's side, and the siege of Mandalore began. The battle unfolded in the shadow of the domed capital. Maul's super commandos clashed with Republic forces on walkways and landing platforms, while deep within the city, Ahsoka hunted the Zabrak warlord through flickering industrial depths. Their duel was a quiet echo of the greater galactic conflict: Jedi training against dark side cunning, clone discipline against Mandalorian ferocity. In the end, Maul's regime fell. He was captured, his loyalists scattered. Mandalore was briefly free of his grip, yet the victory was hollow almost immediately. Order 66 rippled through the clones, turning the Republic into the core of a new galactic empire. The war ended, but the darkness did not. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history. Mandalore had rejected Maul and survived civil war, only to stand before a far more relentless force. The Empire's shadow was only beginning to fall, and for the Mandalorians, its arrival would prove more devastating than any Sith usurper. Under the Empire's heel, collaboration, rebellion, and control. The Empire's shadow did not simply fall on Mandalore. It reached in with careful hands and rearranged its future power. Rarely arrives with open war when subtle control is cheaper and cleaner. So the question became how to bend the warrior world without breaking it. The answer for the Empire was collaboration. In the years after the Clone Wars, Mandalore found itself under the watchful eye of Imperial governors and advisors. The planet's civil conflicts and Maul's brief occupation had weakened its institutions. What followed was a quiet replacement of leaders. Those who embraced Imperial order were elevated. Those who resisted disappeared. Among the most prominent of these new rulers stood Gar Saxon, a former Death Watch warrior who accepted a title as Imperial Viceroy under Saxon Mandalore, wore the armor of autonomy, but its spine had been chained to Coruscant stormtroopers, watched the streets. Imperial officers monitored clan councils, and the old warrior codes were recast as dangerous relics of a less civilized age. Yet the Empire understood that Mandalore's value was not only in its people, it was in its metal, Beskar, the legendary iron that could defy blaster fire and even stand against a Jedi lightsaber. For thousands of years, Beskar had been sacred to Mandalorians, forged into armor that told the story of each clan, scar by scar. The Empire saw something else, a strategic resource. If controlled, it would equip elite forces. If suppressed, it would deny potential enemies a powerful defense. So mines were catalogued, shipments monitored, and entire forges brought under Imperial oversight. What they found there would change everything, not through revelation, but through fear. The realization that a single world could arm or disarm rebellions across the galactic frontier over time. This pressure fractured Mandalorian society. Some clans aligned with Saxon and the Empire, trading loyalty for security and influence. Others bent their heads in public, but kept their traditions alive in secret. There were Mandalorians who joined Imperial commandos, who trained stormtroopers in close-quarters combat, and who wore modified armor alongside white plastoid. There were also farmers and artisans who buried helmets behind homesteads, hoping their children might never need to wear them. Opposition did not vanish. It simply moved into the shadows. Bo-Katan Kryze, who had once fought beside Death Watch, refused to accept Saxon's authority or Imperial rule. She and other dissidents formed scattered cells, striking at supply depots, rescuing prisoners, and seeking allies among off-world resistance movements. Their numbers were small, but their symbolism was immense. They kept the flame of Mandalorian independence alive, when open war would have meant annihilation. Then the pattern of open politics and hidden resistance gave way to something quieter and more fragile. Imagine Mandalorian cities under curfew plazas that once echoed with jetpack drills, now patrolled by walkers, armor sealed in crates beneath stone floors. Children hearing stories of ancient battles only in hushed tones behind shuttered windows. In those hours, the Mandalorians were not charging into conflict. They were enduring it, waiting for the moment when the Beskar would be unburied and the songs of war could be sung aloud again. The Great Purge. Night of 1,000 Tears. Those buried armories and whispered drills existed under a constant shadow because the Empire had not finished with Mandalore. It had only been waiting in the dark when its moment came. The result was not an occupation or a siege. It was an erasure. What followed was remembered as the Great Purge, and in hushed tones as the Night of 1,000 Tears. Sometime in the height of Imperial power, after the Clone Wars and the fall of the Republic, the decision was made in cold corridors far from the red sands of Mandalore. The Empire would no longer manage Mandalorians. It would break them. The world that had once challenged Jedi and shaken galactic history would be reduced to wreckage and silence. The assault did not begin with a duel or a declaration. It began with a sky filling slowly with T, i.e., bombers, their wings cutting across the domes that had sheltered generations of warriors. Then the first fusion bombs fell. Glass and steel did not shatter. They melted. City skylines ran downward in glowing rivers. Towers folded in on themselves as if kneeling under an invisible hand of the dark side. Streets that had echoed with jetpack engines became channels of molten debris from orbit. The bombardment painted the night in orange and white. Every detonation sent shockwaves racing across the plains. The farms that had once fed pacifist New Mandalorians and warrior clans alike were scoured away. Fields of armor and weapons, storage depots and training grounds were caught in the firestorm. When the heat finally faded, it left behind something unnatural, a landscape studded with warped and shattered Beskar. For thousands of years, Beskar had been the quiet heart of Mandalorian power. Now it became a resource to be strip-mined stormtroopers in sealed armor, walked through ash and twisted metal, collecting helmets, breastplates, and raw ore. Anything that could be pried from the ground was seized. What they found there would change everything for the survivors. The Empire did not merely hoard this metal. It smelted it in hidden foundries, reforging it into experimental armor prototypes and secret projects meant to turn Mandalorian resilience into Imperial strength. The human cost was worse than the material loss. Entire clans vanished under the bombardment bloodlines that trace back to Mandalore I, ended in a single night. Others escaped only by scattering into the outer rim, disappearing as mercenaries, bounty hunters, or refugees in borrowed clothes. Some followed the ancient way of the Mandalore, retreating into covert cells beneath forgotten worlds, never removing their helmets, never speaking their true names over time. The Purge pressed itself into Mandalorian memory, as both wound and warning children born far from the homeworld grew up hearing that Mandalore was cursed, that to gather openly was to invite annihilation. Even among Imperial officers, the planet became a haunted assignment, a dead world of glassed cities and silent fortresses, its name spoken with the same caution given to Sith ruins and battlefields steeped in the dark. Mandalore itself became an echo, a place of strange armor in a spaceport, a lone warrior hired for a distant war, an orphan clutching a battered helmet that no one recognized. Mandalore itself became an echo, a place of ghosts and questions, setting the stage for the scattered survivors who would one day decide whether the creed was a memory or a destiny. Children of the Watch, the creed in exile. In the silence that followed the Purge, Mandalorians became shadows in their own history. Some fled to distant worlds, others hid in plain sight beneath unremarkable armor and false names. Among these scattered survivors, one creed retreated deeper than most into the tunnels and forgotten caverns beneath frontier worlds. There, the children of the Watch waited and watched the story of this hidden sect began with an old wound Death Watch had once tried to reclaim Mandalore through terror and civil war. And though its banners fell, its ideas did not entirely die. Instead, they were pared down, hardened, and carried forward by those who believed that Mandalorian strength had been lost through compromise over time. Those ideas fused into a single, uncompromising rule. This is the way in the dim chambers of their covert power was expressed not through grand armies or fleets, but through ritual. Every helm remained sealed. Every face remained a secret. The question arose, what happens to a people when even the act of being seen is forbidden? The answer for the children of the Watch was simple. Visibility meant vulnerability in a galaxy ruled by an empire that had already tried to erase them. Never removing the helmet in front of another living being became more than superstition. It became a shield against extinction. This discipline shaped every moment of their lives. Shared meals were taken in solitude. Voices echoed from behind metal visors, and even in training duels, the hollow clang of Beskar replaced the intimacy of expression. What followed was a culture that chose anonymity over recognition. Yet beneath the armor, their identity burned fiercely. They believed that in a dark galactic age, the helmet was Mandalore. At the center of many such covenants stood a single calm presence. The armorer in the glow of the forge, she served as both spiritual guide and practical artisan. Her hammer strikes were measured her words even more so, as she interpreted the way of the Mandalore. For those who sought answers, shards of Beskar recovered from battlefields, and Imperial stockpiles passed through her hands, melted in the fire, and were reborn as new plates. Each piece found a bearer among the foundlings. These foundlings were orphans of war and conflict, taken in from ruined villages and shattered starships. Some were human, others were not yet. Once they swore, the creed, species, and bloodline dissolved the ancient belief that Mandalorian was a choice, not a race. Survived through this quiet adoption, this act of mercy would reshape galactic history in ways none of them could. Yet, see, among the smallest of these rescued children was one boy whose home had fallen to separatist droids, whose last memory of his parents was framed by explosions and approaching metal. Over time, the covert would give him armor, a name, and a purpose, and the galaxy would come to know him as Din Djarin. But the true weight of his path had only just begun to stir in the dark. Din Djarin, a foundling's path through a broken galaxy in the chaos of the Clone Wars, one small act of compassion unfolded beneath the roar of engines and the scream of artillery. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history, though no one present could sense its full weight. Yet on a nameless world under separatist assault, a child hid among shattered stone and drifting ash. Super battle droids advanced in cold formation, their blasters cutting through homes, and hope with the same mechanical precision. The story of Din Djarin began there, not with armor or weapons, but with fear and sudden silence as his parents pushed him into a cellar and met the advancing metal alone. What followed was an explosion, a shockwave, and then the slow hiss of settling dust. When the hatch finally opened, it was not droids that peered down, but Mandalorians' jetpacks, venting steam armor scorched from close combat. They were children of the Watch, a fundamentalist splinter of a culture already broken by war and occupation. They ended the droids with ruthless efficiency, yet when they saw the trembling boy, one warrior extended a hand instead of a blaster. That silent offer of shelter bound the foundling to the way of the Mandalore over time. The covert became his world-hidden tunnels, and echoing chambers replaced open skies. The clang of hammers on Beskar replaced the sounds of his lost home. The armorer's voice reciting creed and custom shaped his sense of self more than any memory of his parents. The rule was simple and absolute. The helmet never came off before others. The face became a secret. The armor, a second skin. The creed, a shield against a galaxy that had already taken everything once as an adult. Din Djarin moved through the ruins of the fallen empire as a bounty hunter, his Beskar plates dull and piecemeal. At first, he walked through frontier cantinas and lawless outposts as a living echo of ancient Mandalorian warriors. Few remembered Mandalore's full history, but all understood the quiet authority of a visor that never revealed the eyes in a time when the Jedi were myth and the Sith plotted in shadows. His power came from reputation, discipline, and the relentless honoring of his word. His adherence to the creed was both strength and cage, never removing the helmet, never abandoning a contract, always protecting foundlings in need. Each choice reflected the resilience and rigidity of his sect's interpretation of Mandalorian identity, even as the galactic order shifted from republic to empire to fractured remnant. His path remained narrow, one man bound to promises made in the dark. Then a pattern broke instead of another faceless target. A small green child stared up from a floating cradle, tiny hand reaching toward the armored stranger. The sound of Beskar plates settling as Din hesitated cut through the background noise in that pause history. Bent the armorer would later press a mudhorn signet into cooling metal, declaring them a clan of two, and her soft words would shape everything. This is the way around them. Empires rose and fell. Jedi secrets resurfaced, and the dark side stirred. Yet, at the center remained something disarmingly simple. One man, one child, one clan, slowly forming in the ruins of history. Their quiet journey would lead back toward Mandalore itself, and toward long-buried questions of what it truly meant to be Mandalorian. The Darksaber returns. Bo-Katan, Gideon, and a blade, without a master power, can rest in crowns and councils. But there are moments in galactic history when it narrows to a single object, a relic that carries the weight of a people for Mandalore. That relic was the Darksaber, a weapon of light-side discipline forged by a Mandalorian Jedi, and then claimed by generations who walked closer to the dark. Over time, it became more than a blade. It became a verdict on who had the right to lead. By the final days of the Clone Wars, the Darksaber rested in the hands of Bo-Katan Kryze, gifted to her after she rejected the tyranny of Darth Maul and his Shadow Collective. Mandalore had fallen into yet another cycle of conflict, and what followed was an uneasy hope. Bo-Katan held the blade not as a conqueror, but as a promise that Mandalorians could stand together without kneeling to Sith warlords or Republic generals. Yet the Empire rose, and with it came the Great Purge, the Night of 1,000 Tears, and the quiet disappearance of the Darksaber into Imperial vaults and secrets in the age of the Empire. The weapon resurfaced, far from Mandalore, in the grasp of Moff Gideon, an Imperial officer draped in authority. He had no right to claim his possession of. The Darksaber was more than a trophy. It was a declaration that the Empire now held Mandalorian heritage, in chains a single black blade cutting through Beskar, and memory reminding scattered survivors that their symbols now served their conquerors when Gideon finally crossed paths with Din Djarin in the deep corridors of an Imperial cruiser. The confrontation was meant to be simple: a rescue, a battle, a victory. Instead, the story of the Darksaber twisted again. Din defeated Gideon in combat, and by the old creed of Tara Vizsla, the blade answered to him. Tradition was clear. The Darksaber passed through victory, not through gift. Yet Din had no desire for thrones or titles. His path was the way. His clan, his child, Bo-Katan, arrived, expecting to reclaim the weapon, and through it the right to rally Mandalorian clans. Yet in that quiet, ruined chamber, the transfer became strangely impossible. Din tried to hand it to her, but the blade would not be so easily given. The tension between them was not hatred, but Wait Bo-Katan's political ambition and deep sense of duty pressed against Din's reluctance and confusion. The Darksaber in his hand felt less like a prize and more like a burden, a beacon that called to a fractured people who no longer agreed on what Mandalore should be. Their stalemate hung in the air, a silent question of destiny and belief around them. The Empire crumbled, but the future of Mandalore remained uncertain. Once again, the fate of a single blade would shape whether their shattered homeworld could rise from ruin or drift further into legend, and the answer would wait in the dark for whoever dared to claim it fully. What does it mean to be Mandalorian? Blood, creed, or choice? In the quiet that followed that unanswered question, another rose beneath it. What does it truly mean to be Mandalorian? Is it blood, a creed, a choice? The story of this people suggests that it has never been only one thing in the beginning. It was a species. The Taung, driven from Coruscant, hunted and diminished until Mandalore the First led them to a harsh new world. What they found there would change everything. They carved their name into the planet itself. Mandalore, and for thousands of years, Mandalorian meant Taung warrior, conqueror and survivor. Entire continents bore the scars of those early crusades as their power spread across the galactic rim. Over time, the word began to stretch. The Taung accepted humans and other species into their ranks, not as servants, but as Mandalorians. The culture became a banner that others could claim through training and oath, instead of ancestry alone. When Mandalore the Ultimate led the Mandalorian Wars against the Republic, many of his commanders were not Taung at all. Yet, their armor, their tactics, and their devotion to the code would shape Jedi history at Malachor V and beyond. Centuries later, the meaning shifted again under Duchess Satine Kryze. Mandalore tried to abandon constant war. The new Mandalorians turned away from armor and weapons, embracing neutrality and the light side ideals of peace. For a moment, Mandalorian meant pacifist statesman artist, but in the shadows, Deathwatch clung to an older vision of honor through combat, while Darth Maul twisted that hunger into his own dark empire on Sundari. Even then, the label fractured between extremists, pacifists, and the silent majority trapped between them. Heritage houses insisted that blood mattered. House Vizsla guarded the Darksaber as proof that leadership flowed through a single ancestral line creed. Focused sects, such as the Children of the Watch, claimed that adherence to the Way mattered more than lineage. Helmets never removed rules, never broken. For the next 1,000 years in their imagination, Mandalorian identity would be preserved not by birth, but by ritual. Then there were clans under leaders such as Bo-Katan, Kryze, more pragmatic, more flexible, willing to fight beside former enemies. Jedi rebels, even clones if it meant Mandalore might endure through all of this. Another threat remained constant foundlings, abandoned children and refugees, taken in and sworn to the code. Many of the most influential Mandalorians in history were not born on Mandalore, did not share its bloodlines, yet through adoption and armor, this act of mercy would reshape galactic history again and again, because armor language and shared stories became a portable home when the Empire shattered their cities. and the Night of 1,000 Tears turned Sundari to glass Mandalorians, carried Beskar plates, old proverbs and tales of Taravisla into exile. Their world could fall, their people could scatter, but a helmet, a painted sigil, and a spoken vow could recreate Mandalore on any forgotten moon. Imagine now, a quiet gathering beyond time, a circle of warriors around a single low fire beneath a cold night sky, a Taung Crusader in scarred plate, a new Mandalorian diplomat in soft robes, a Death Watch, zealot, a foundling raised in the Watch, and Bo-Katan's modern rebels, their armor styles clash, their beliefs collide, yet the same stars shine on every visor in that silence. Mandalorian no longer means one path. It becomes a question each of them must answer, and in the next chapter of their history, others will try to answer it in steel and flame once more. Clans in the shadows, Mandalorians during the Galactic Civil War, in the age of the Galactic Civil War, when the Rebel Alliance and the Empire struggled for control of the galactic core worlds, Mandalore itself had already fallen silent. The great banners were gone. The capital shattered, the clans scattered across the stars. What remained of this warrior culture did not march as one army. Instead, Mandalorians survived as fragments, a hidden family on a backwater moon, a lone mercenary drifting from contract to contract, a covert buried beneath the streets of an Imperial world over time. These remnants stopped thinking in terms of planetary rule and began thinking in terms of simple survival. Power still mattered, but it was no longer the power of open conquest. It was the quiet leverage of a single armored figure in the right place, at the right moment. Some of these warriors remembered the old codes. Some clung to the way and never removed their helmets. Others bent those customs until they were nearly unrecognizable. Yet each carried echoes of a history that for thousands of years had terrified the Republic and the Jedi. In this era of stormtroopers and star destroyers, Mandalorians did not stand together against the Empire. Many never even had that choice. Some were pressed into Imperial service, trained as commandos or bounty hunters. Their Beskar, or what passed for it, turned into another weapon of the regime. Others slipped into the shadows of the rebellion, serving as infiltrators, transport pilots, or deniable assets, whose armor drew nervous glances in rebel briefing rooms, and many more chose neither side, avoiding the great conflict entirely to protect hidden foundlings or to sell their skills quietly on the fringes. What followed was a strange inversion of earlier Mandalorian Wars. Instead of a unified crusade against the Jedi, there were isolated duels in alleys and hangars, a Mandalorian blaster clearing a path for a rebel cell on one world, while another Mandalorian squad eliminated dissidents for an Imperial moth on another. The story of this period is not a single banner raised over a battlefield, but a constellation of small decisions, each one nudging the balance of power by a fraction, then disappearing into rumor for the wider galaxy. Mandalorians during the Galactic Civil War became more myth than nation. There were no public leaders, no open armies, only scattered sightings, a flash of T-visor armor in a crowded spaceport, a quiet rumor of a warrior who could stand against a Jedi and live. Historians argued over whether Mandalore still existed. At all, archivists debated whether the old tales of crusades and Darksaber duels were exaggerated legends or suppressed truth. To most citizens, the word Mandalorian meant danger and mystery, but not politics. Into that fog stepped figures such as Boba Fett. His dented armor evoked Mandalorian heritage, even as his personal connection to Mandalorian culture remained complex and fiercely debated. Some saw him as a pretender wearing scavenged plate, others as a successor to a lineage broken by the Purge. Either way, his presence in Jabba's palace and aboard Imperial flagships reminded admirals and smugglers alike that this warrior tradition had not fully vanished as the second Death Star burned above Endor and the Empire began to fracture. Those scattered clans watched carefully. Some saw opportunity, others saw only another distant war. Yet the fall of one empire and the rise of a new republic would shape their fate once more. And in the shifting quiet that followed, Mandalorians would again be drawn out of the shadows toward the center of galactic history, Boba Fett and the legacy of the armor in that drifting aftermath. another figure stepped out of the smoke and into galactic legend. Not a warlord commanding fleets or a Mandalore uniting clans, but a single armored hunter moving through the margins of history. His name was Boba Fett. Power often announces itself with speeches, parades and banners, yet sometimes the most enduring symbols are silent. Boba Fett rarely spoke, yet his presence carried a quiet threat. His armor was unmistakable. Battered green plates over durasteel and Beskar, a T-shaped visor that revealed nothing, and a rangefinder angled down like a predator's gaze for many across the galaxy. That silhouette became the definition of Mandalorian. His story began decades earlier with another armored warrior, Jango Fett. Jango was a renowned bounty hunter whose skills drew the attention of the Kaminoan cloners and the Sith, orchestrating the rise of the Grand Army of the Republic. He provided the genetic template for millions of clone troopers, but demanded one unaltered clone for himself, a son Boba Fett. The story of this boy grown in a sterile lab yet raised in a harsh warrior's trade would shape how Mandalorian armor was seen. For thousands of years, Jango's own status among Mandalorians was contested. Some called him Mandalore. Others dismissed him as an outcast who had merely claimed the armor after some forgotten conflict official records in the later Republic era. Even argued that he was no true Mandalorian at all, only a mercenary wearing stolen gear. What followed was a long shadow of ambiguity. Boba inherited not only Jango's helmet and jetpack, but also the questions around them to citizens of the Empire, and even to many Jedi. The distinction did not matter. They saw a lone gunfighter, wrapped in Beskar colors, stalking the halls of Jabba's palace, or standing wordless beside Darth Vader on the Executor, and assumed this was Mandalore distilled into one man, ruthless, efficient, unyielding his few actions on screen, capturing Han Solo without a word, surviving in Vader's presence, without flinching were enough to turn his armor into a mythic image of Mandalorians themselves, a culture reduced to a single helmet. Yet Boba Fett's survival, after the Sarlacc hinted at something older, buried beneath the bounty contracts and carbonite trophies, torn from the pit and left scarred. He wandered Tatooine's deserts among Tusken tribes and criminal remnants. Over time, he began to move differently, no longer only a weapon for hire, but a man searching for a code to live by, taking Jabba's throne, enforcing a rough order in Mos Espa, and forging tentative alliances. He echoed Mandalorian themes of survival, reinvention, and clan. Even without a clan, his connection to Mandalorian culture remained complicated. Some refused to recognize him. Others saw in his resilience the stubborn heart of Mandalore itself. Yet his armor never left the galactic stage through dark years when Mandalorian worlds burned and their history vanished into Imperial archives. That familiar visor, unwanted posters, hollows, and whispered stories kept the idea of Mandalorians alive until the day their true past and scattered people would step forward again to reclaim the legend behind the mask. Rebels, Sabian Wren, and the spark of reunification in the shadow of that familiar T-shaped visor. Another Mandalorian story began far from Mandalore itself, not with a hardened warlord, but with a teenager wielding paint and explosives instead of a throne. This was the story of Sabine Wren, a young warrior whose armor was as bright as Mandalore's recent history, was darkborn into Clan Wren of House Vizsla. Sabine grew up under the Empire's grip on Mandalorian space, trained as an Imperial cadet. She was a prodigy in weapons design and tactics. Yet what followed was a quiet betrayal of everything Mandalorian. When the Empire turned her work into instruments of terror against her own people, she carried the guilt into exile, joining the rebel crew of the Ghost as an artist, a demolitions expert, and a restless Mandalorian without a home. Around the years leading up to the Battle of Yavin, the Force guided Sabine toward an ancient symbol of her culture. During a mission on Dathomir, she discovered the Darksaber in the lair of Maul. The black blade, once forged by Tara Vizsla, still hummed with the weight of Mandalorian history. What they found there would change everything. Because the Darksaber was more than a weapon. It was a claim, a question of who had the right to lead. And at first, Sabine refused that burden. She saw only the blood on her hands and the Empire that had twisted her genius, but under the patient guidance of the former Jedi. Kanan Jarrus and the veteran protector Fen Rao, she began to train with the blade. Each slow arc and parry forced her to confront memories of the superweapon. She had designed a device that targeted Mandalorian armor and turned Beskar into a prison of searing energy in one shattering confrontation. She finally voiced her shame and anger, and the Darksaber answered her resolve, rather than her fear. Over time, the training became something larger than technique. It was a Mandalorian reclaiming her culture piece by fractured piece. Sabine returned to Mandalorian space, carrying the Darksaber into the halls of Clan Ren, and beyond, she challenged Imperial collaborators, fought Gar Saxon, the Empire's viceroy, and proved in single combat that her cause had power. When her mother, Ursa Ren, her brother Tristan, and other clans witnessed the black blade in her hands, old loyalties began to stir. Yet Sabine did not see herself as Mandalore's destined ruler. Instead, she sought the one who could unite more than a handful of scattered banners. That search led her to Bo-Katan Kryze, veteran of the Clone Wars, former lieutenant of Death Watch, and reluctant heir to Satine's broken dream. In a solemn moment, Sabine offered Bo-Katan the Darksaber, believing that this act of mercy would reshape galactic history by giving Mandalore a leader strong enough to resist the Empire. For a brief time, it worked. Clans' rallied armor shone in open defiance, and the prospect of Mandalore's restoration flickered on the horizon. But Mandalorian history moves in cycles of hope and ruin, and the Empire had not yet played its darkest hand. Soon, the skies above Mandalore would burn in a storm remembered as the Great Purge, and the promise carried by that black blade would be shattered once more. Return to a ruined world, Mandalore. After the Purge, the promise of restoration died in fire. What followed was not simply a defeat in war, but the unmaking of a world in the wake of the Great Purge. Mandalore itself became the Empire's final warning to a people who refused to bow. The domed cities that had once glowed against the desert night were shattered, their graceful curves torn open, their transparent canopies melted and fused into jagged curtains of glass and metal. In the years after the bombardment, the surface of Mandalore lay broken and silent. The fusion bombs and relentless turbo-laser fire had turned plains to glass and cities to cratered graveyards. Lingering radiation clung to the soil and drifted in invisible currents through the ruined streets. Even for Mandalorians, whose armor was built to endure the harshest environments, the homeworld had become a place approached with caution and often with dread. Scattered Imperial remnants haunted the wreckage. Patrol droids still walked prescribed paths through districts that no longer existed. Sensors swept across empty plazas, listening for movements that would never come. A few garrisons remained buried in hardened bunkers. Automated defense grids flickered to life at random, firing into dust storms and broken towers as if the war had never ended. The Empire was gone, but its shadow still held power. Here, over time, a belief settled over the survivors. Mandalore was cursed. Some said the world itself had turned against its children, that the dark side had seeped into the glass deserts and poisoned sky. Others spoke in more practical terms of unstable reactors, toxic clouds, and collapsing structures, but the conclusion was the same. Mandalore was no longer a home. It was a wound. Many clans chose exile over return. They scattered to frontier moons, trade stations, and forgotten agri-worlds, carrying their armor, their language, and their songs into every corner of galactic space. The story of their people would shape distant communities rather than one central world creed, replace territory as the anchor of identity. A Mandalorian was Mandalorian, not because of soil underfoot, but because of the vow spoken beneath a helmet. In this quiet diaspora, the emotional weight of the ruined planet deepened every tale. Elders spoke of crystal cities and banners snapping in clean artificial winds, while children who had never seen Mandalore imagined a world that was both myth and graveyard, a place where the past could not be reclaimed, only remembered. Among them, a question lingered: could a people survive when their heart had been turned to ash? Then the scene narrows, the galactic canvas falls away. Imagine a stretch of grey dust under a darkened Mandalorian sky. The air is still the horizon, broken by the skeletons of fallen towers, half buried in ash rests. A single helmet, its once polished Beskar dulled and scorched. The T-shaped visor stares upward, empty, catching the faint reflection of distant stars. Nothing moves. There is no battle, no anthem, only that silent, watchful gaze, holding the memory of a world that refused to forget, even after everything else had been taken in that stillness. Mandalore is no longer a place. It is an echo, waiting for the day someone dares to answer it. The way and the future attempts to reclaim Mandalore. In that stillness, Mandalore is no longer a place. It is an echo, waiting for the day someone dares to answer it. What happens when an echo finally meets a voice strong enough to answer the story of the modern Mandalorians suggests that answer begins with a single, stubborn choice to return in the years after the Great Purge, when the Empire's firestorms had already turned cities to glass and armor to ash. Bo-Katan Kryze carried that choice like a burden and a promise. She had worn the title of regent and watched her world fall. She had held the Darksaber and lost it, and yet she remained determined to retake Mandalore not as a throne for one house, but as a home for all clans scattered across the galactic rim. For her, the black blade forged by Tara Vizsla was more than a weapon. It was a symbol that could draw warriors out of hiding and convince them that Mandalore still existed, somewhere beyond poisoned skies and shattered domes. What followed was a slow gathering of strays and survivors, covert cells and proud banners, answering a call they had once believed was gone forever. But reclaiming a world was never only a matter of marching home. It exposed fractures that had been growing for thousands of years beneath the Beskar. The children of the Watch clung to an ancient creed, never removing helmets, living in secret, and insisting this was the one true way. More traditional clans remembered feast halls and open faces, and saw the helmet rule as a narrow echo of a broader warrior code. Between them stood pragmatic leaders who understood that without unity, any return would end in another civil war. Each faction carried its own memory of Mandalore, and each believed the force of that memory would shape what came next. Could Mandalorians honor the old ways without repeating the endless cycles of conquest and rebellion that had once drawn Jedi and Sith into their orbit? Or would the dark side of pride and vengeance drag them back into familiar ruin? Even if the clans agreed on a banner, the planet itself had become an enemy. The poisoned atmosphere of Mandalore demanded sealed armor and careful routes through irradiated plains, shattered dome cities, hid unexploded munitions and forgotten Imperial traps. Droid remnants and buried arsenals waited. Beneath the dust infrastructure that had once supported a thriving warrior culture lay in twisted ruined power grids, silent foundries cold, yet over time amid ruined basilicas and collapsed strongholds, small proofs of survival appeared. A reforged forge glowing again beneath the surface, a single farm sprouting beneath reconstructed shielding, a patrol of armored figures walking side by side across the glassed desert, not as ghosts, but as owners of the ground, their boots touched in those quiet marches under broken skies. A different kind of hope emerged. Perhaps Mandalore would one day be fully reborn, a world of clear air and open plazas where Beskar gleamed in the sun. Or perhaps the planet would remain scarred while the culture flowed outward through clans, creeds, and foundlings for the next 1,000 years. Whether the homeworld is reclaimed in stone and soil or only in story, Mandalorian history has already proven one thing: the people endure even when the planet does not. Armor, language, and song, the texture of Mandalorian life. Mandalore might be broken, but the texture of Mandalorian life endures in smaller details, carried on armor, in voices, and in quiet rituals. Power and war dominate their reputation, yet beneath the Beskar there is a softer story, one that would shape how the clans endure long after empires fall and the force shifts between dark side and light side. Every suit of armor begins as metal, but it does not stay anonymous for long. Colors are not decoration so much as declaration. Deep green for duty, crimson for honoring a parent, gold for vengeance fulfilled. Clan sigils are etched or painted onto pauldrons and breastplates, the Mythosaur skull looming over some, the night owl visor on others. Small marks, almost invisible at a distance, record battles survive, oaths taken, and losses carried. Over time, a single cuirass becomes the story of its wearer, a walking chronicle that can be read by anyone who understands the code. The same is true of their language. Mando'ade flows through the clans as a binding thread, even when war and exile scatter them across the galactic map. Simple phrases, murmured through helmet filters, carry centuries of meaning. Ret ursia mihi, as a farewell that promises reunion. Nikartail gar darasum, as an oath of unending loyalty. Children hear proverbs before they understand them, short lines about standing together against the dark, about family chosen rather than born. What followed was a culture that could be fragmented in space, yet remain whole in sound. Around the communal fires of hidden encampments, those words gain weight. Adoption rituals for foundlings are spoken in Mando'ade, the vow repeated in low, steady tones while a small helmet is gently lowered into place. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history again and again as orphans of Sith plots, Jedi wars, and Imperial purges found a new name and a new clan. Communal meals reinforce the bond. Helmets tilt back in unison or are removed only in trusted company as steaming bowls and shared plates pass from hand to hand. In the glow of the forge, another ritual unfolds. Armorers stand in almost religious reverence, treated less as artisans and more as keepers of memory. Each hammer strike against Beskar is deliberate, accompanied by quiet invocations of the way and reminders of ancient codes. To many Mandalorians, the forge is where history becomes tangible, where loss is melted down and reshaped into protection for the next generation. Their songs reflect this same balance of hardness and tenderness. There are battle chants that recall the Mandalorian Wars against the Jedi and the Old Republic, verses about crusaders on distant worlds and shattered fleets drifting in the dark. Yet there are also softer songs, telling the story of found families, of warriors who laid down arms to raise children, of clans that chose survival over endless conflict. For a moment, imagine those voices not raised in battle, but hushed. A parent's filtered voice humming a Mandalorian lullaby in Mando'ade, the consonants softened, the melody slow and steady. A language built for warriors becomes a gentle rhythm, a promise that the armor will hold, that the night will pass. To fall asleep to that sound is to rest inside a culture that has known war for thousands of years, yet still makes room for quiet, for care, and for dreams of what might come next. Patterns of rise and ruin, cycles in Mandalorian history. In that quiet song, another pattern begins to emerge, steady as a heartbeat under armor. Power rises, power falls, and in between those peaks and valleys, a people learn, forget, and learn again what it means to endure. The story of the Mandalorians is not a straight line of conquest, but a circle traced and retraced across galactic history. Again and again, Mandalorians gather beneath a single banner, drawn to a leader who promises clarity, strength, and purpose. Under Mandalore the Ultimate, they became a unified spear hurled at the Republic, a warrior culture testing itself against Jedi and fleets in a vast Mandalorian war. What followed was a brutal expansion. Worlds burned and claimed in the name of honor, until a different kind of champion rose to meet them. Revan, once a Jedi, shattered their crusade at Malachor 5, turning their greatest battlefield into a graveyard. The clans that had marched in perfect formation were broken, scattered to the edges of known space, left to rebuild their identity from ruins and memories. Over time, the pattern repeated in a different key. During the Clone Wars, Duchess Satine Kryze tried to break the cycle entirely. She forged the new Mandalorians into a pacifist government, neutral in a galaxy sliding toward total war. The armor was stored away, the cities remade into shining, peaceful domes. On the surface, it seemed the old way had been buried. Yet beneath that calm, resentment smoldered. Deathwatch, plotted in the shadows, convinced that true Mandalorian honor lived only in the clash of blades and the roar of jetpacks. When Death Watch allied with Darth Maul and the Shadow Collective, internal division opened the door to external domination. Mandalore did not fall to a vast invading empire in that moment, but to a small group that understood how to turn Mandalorians against themselves. Satine's dream collapsed, Maul claimed the Darksaber, and once more the world became a prize in someone else's larger conflict. A people split between warriors and pacifists, traditionalists and reformers, found their future decided by outsiders who knew how to pull at those fractures. Later, Bo-Katan Kryze would try to reverse that fate. She lifted the Darksaber as a symbol, calling scattered houses and clans to stand together against the Empire. For a brief moment, unity seemed possible again, a new Mandalore rising from the ashes of civil war and occupation. Then came the Great Purge, the Night of 1,000 Tears, when Imperial fire and droids fell on Mandalore with merciless precision. The cities were glassed, the Beskar seized, and helmets lay empty in the dust. Yet even this was not an ending. Surviving Mandalorians fled into tunnels, hidden coverts, distant worlds. Some clung to the ancient creed and the way of the Mandalore, never removing their helmets, turning survival into a strict, almost religious discipline. Others adapted in quieter ways, passing down language, songs, and the memory of Beskar to children who had never seen their homeworld. Mandalorian culture did not disappear. It thinned. It hid. It waited. Seen from a distance, a rhythm becomes clear. Unity, expansion, confrontation with greater powers, catastrophe, scattering, slow rebirth. Each era dresses the pattern in new armor: Crusader, Pacifist, Rebel, Exile, but the underlying questions remain. What does it mean to be Mandalorian when war brings ruin? Yet war is woven into heritage. How does a people built on strength confront the vulnerability that comes with division? Understanding these cycles turns Mandalorians from background warriors into something more complex. They become a mirror for the struggle between survival and honor, between adaptation and tradition, between the lure of power and the cost of using it. In their rise and ruin, a listener can trace the same tension that runs through Jedi and Sith, through Republic and Empire, the difficulty of changing without losing oneself. And somewhere beyond the last fall, in the quiet after the Purge, the pattern waits to be drawn again by a new generation, under a new banner, beneath the same unchanging stars. Mandalorians and the Force. Allies, enemies, and rare bridges. In that quiet pattern of rise and ruin, one thread runs strangely against the grain, the uneasy dance between Mandalorians and the Force. Power divides them. But what happens when that power flows not from armor or artillery, but from an invisible energy field that binds the galaxy together? The answer is a rivalry that would shape entire eras of galactic history. Long before clone troopers and stormtroopers, during the age of the Old Republic, this tension erupted into open war. Around the time of Mandalore the Ultimate, the Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders turned their gaze on the Republic, and what followed was the Mandalorian Wars. These were not simple raids. They were a calculated campaign against the Jedi themselves. Mandalorian strategists studied the Order, dissecting the advantages of the light side. In response, they forged weapons and doctrines meant to neutralize it. Beskar armor that could withstand lightsabers, scattershot and flamethrowers to break concentration, basilisk war droids, and massed artillery to overwhelm even the most gifted Jedi Knight. On worlds from Dixon to Serrico, Jedi battle meditation met disciplined combined arms tactics. The final horror at Malachor 5, where Revan and the Mass Shadow Generator shattered the Mandalorian fleet, ended the war, but not the memory. For thousands of years, Mandalorian songs would remember Jedi not as distant peacekeepers, but as worthy, hated enemies. Over time, this bred a cultural reflex. Mandalorians came to view the Force with suspicion, even hostility. To them, power should be earned through training, discipline, and the weight of Beskar on the wrist, not granted by invisible currents. Mysticism belonged to others. Mandalorians trusted armor more than prophecy, jetpacks more than visions, and the only destiny that mattered was the one chosen in battle. Even in later centuries, under Republic or Empire, a child showing Force sensitivity among the clans might be regarded with quiet unease, as if carrying a spark from an old and dangerous fire. Yet the story of Mandalorians and the Force is not only a story of conflict. In a much earlier age, one Mandalorian walked straight into the heart of the Jedi Order and was accepted. Tare Vizsla, the first Mandalorian Jedi, forged the Darksaber within the temple, a weapon whose black blade and humming edge fused Mandalorian craftsmanship with Jedi tradition. What they found there would change everything, a symbol that both sides would claim. After Tare's death, the Jedi kept the blade until House Vizsla stole it back, turning it into a rallying standard for Mandalorian leaders. Centuries later, rare alliances echoed that bridge. During the Clone Wars, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Duchess Satine Kryze stood together against Death Watch and against Sith schemes that threatened Mandalore. In the Age of the Empire and beyond, scattered clans fought beside Jedi and other Force users against a different kind of tyranny, suggesting that identity, even for a warrior people, is not fixed in Durasteel. These fragile connections hint at something deeper, that Mandalorian creed is wide enough to contain even the galaxy's strangest paths, as long as they are walked with conviction. A Mandalorian can be a pacifist, a mercenary, a ruler, even a Jedi. And somewhere beyond the night of 1,000 tears, beyond the ruins and the ashes, whispers grow of new warriors who might carry both Beskar and the Force, heirs to Tare Vizsla's paradox. Whether their arrival will heal old wounds or reopen them is another question waiting in the dark of the next chapter. Echoes across the galaxy, Mandalorian influence on worlds and wars. Power leaves traces even after the warriors are gone. And nowhere is that more evident than in the quiet echoes of Mandalorian footsteps across the stars. Their homeworld burned, their clans scattered, yet their methods, symbols, and reputation continued to move through the galactic bloodstream long after the night of 1,000 tears. Over time, Mandalorians became as much an export of doctrine as of soldiers. Planetary militias on fringe worlds hired Mandalorian mercenaries not only to fight their wars, but to train their recruits. What followed was a slow reshaping of local forces, close-quarters shock tactics, disciplined jetpack assaults, and that distinctive T-visor helmet replicated in cheaper alloys. Crime syndicates and private armies copied the armor silhouettes and squad formations of the old Neo-Crusaders, hoping some of that hard-earned power would cling to them. In backrooms and training yards, the story of ancient crusades became a sales pitch for modern security. The fear of Mandalorian resurgence moved governments as surely as fleets. During the High Republic and the final centuries of the Republic, strategic planners remembered the Mandalorian Wars and the devastation of worlds such as Cathar and Sirocco. Their answer was quiet surveillance, treaties restricting heavy armor exports, and Jedi observers embedded on worlds near Mandalorian space. Under the Empire, this unease hardened into brutality. Disarmament programs, chain codes, and targeted purges aimed to make sure no independent Mandalorian war machine could ever challenge Imperial rule. Even in the era of the New Republic, scattered reports of hidden foundries and covert clans would shape policy debates about rearmament and regional autonomy. Meanwhile, the Mandalorian people themselves rooted in new soils. Concordia, once a mining moon of Mandalore, became a refuge and staging ground, its tunnels and foundries sheltering both pacifists and warriors in different eras. Concord Dawn, an agricultural world on vital hyperlanes, turned into a regional power base where Mandalorian protectors enforced order with a stern, almost knightly code. Kalevala, home to houses such as Kryze, blended aristocratic ritual with Mandalorian armor and ceremony, proof that the culture could wear courtly robes and Beskar in the same breath. Each world carried a distinct accent of Mandalorian identity, fragments of a people refusing to vanish. Over time, their armor and sigils slipped into galactic iconography. Even citizens who knew little of Mandalorian history recognized the T-visor as a symbol of danger and efficiency. Bounty hunters painted Mythosaur skulls on starship hulls, militia banners echoed ancient clan colors, and holodramas turned the lone Mandalorian gunslinger into a stock character. The image traveled farther than the truth. So in almost any corner of the galaxy, a faint Mandalorian footprint might appear. A knife-hand strike in a bar fight, a weathered sigil on a cantina wall, a local legend of a silent guardian in Beskar. The next chapter of this history asks a quieter question. When a culture survives as scattered impressions and borrowed armor, what does it mean to be Mandalorian at all? From legend to bedtime story, reframing the Mandalorian myth. When a culture becomes scattered impressions and borrowed armor, the story of that culture begins to feel less like a military record and more like a legend told in the dark. The Mandalorians have reached that place in galactic memory, where fact and myth blur until only the shape of the tale remains, steady and familiar, repeating across the centuries. Long before Beskar helmets gathered dust on forgotten shelves, there were the Taung on ancient Coruscant, a harsh, warlike people driven into exile by conflict and change. Cast out into the wider galaxy, they journeyed until they found a new world, a wild, dangerous place whose very storms seemed to challenge them. What they found there would change everything. Under Mandalore the First, they conquered that world and named it Mandalore, and what followed was a crusading tradition that would shape their destiny for thousands of years. Over time, the Taung were joined and then replaced by humans and other species, all drawn into a warrior creed that valued strength, loyalty, and the bonds of clan above blood alone. There were the great crusades against the Old Republic, armored legions marching under Mandalore the Ultimate, and the terrible silence. After Malachor V, when Jedi generals such as Revan shattered Mandalorian power in a single, apocalyptic stroke, the galaxy learned to fear those T-shaped visors, then watched them fall, and in the quiet that followed, the legend grew sharper than the reality. Centuries later, Mandalore changed again. Under the new Mandalorians and Duchess Satine Kryze, the planet tried to turn away from war entirely, building bright, sealed domes of glass and white stone over a scarred surface. For a brief moment, the story of this people became one of pacifism and neutrality, of a world determined to stand apart from Sith, Jedi, and Empire alike. Yet even then, in the shadows, Death Watch plotted. The Darksaber passed from hand to hand, and the old armor waited, patient and unforgotten. Then came purges and occupations, civil wars and betrayals, until the Great Purge and the Night of 1,000 Tears ground Mandalore beneath Imperial fire. What survived scattered into space? Covert hideouts in forgotten tunnels, foundlings raised in hidden shrines, quiet warriors trying to live by a code in a galaxy that barely remembered their name. Over time, the image of the Mandalorian shifted from terrifying invader to mercenary in worn armor, then to rumor, then almost to silence. Now imagine all of that, not as a sequence of battles and dates, but as a bedtime story told in a dim Mandalorian stronghold long after the last blaster has cooled. Outside, the stars are distant and still. Inside, a quiet voice speaks of Taung and Crusaders, of Satine and Maul, of purges and foundlings, not to glorify war, but to remember families, leaders with impossible choices, and ordinary warriors who tried again and again to follow away. In that softened retelling, the armor becomes less a weapon and more a cradle for memory, carrying this people gently into whatever comes next. Helmets in the sand, the Mandalorian's unbroken thread. In the end, all of that noise and motion returns to something very small and very quiet. A single Mandalorian helmet resting half buried in sand and ash. Wind moves around it in soft currents, filling the seams with dust, tracing the familiar T-shaped visor that has watched so many battles pass into memory. The storm has moved on. The armor remains. The story of this people can be read in that one abandoned shell. Once it belonged to a Taung Crusader, following Mandalore the First across a wild world that would take his name. Later, it might have framed the gaze of a human warrior standing at Malachor 5, watching the Republic and its Jedi champions unleash a weapon that shattered fleets and futures. Over time, the faces behind the visor changed, but the outline stayed the same, a constant silhouette against a changing galaxy. Around it, invisible in the dust, are the symbols that would shape Mandalorian identity again and again. The cold weight of Beskar, refusing to melt even under the fire of Imperial bombardment. The curled horns of the Mythosaur, first hunted, then remembered, then doubted, until it became less a creature and more a promise that something ancient still sleeps beneath the surface. The Darksaber, humming in the dark, passing from Tara Vizsla's calm Jedi hands to warlords, pretenders, and reluctant leaders who never quite mastered the power it represented. This is the tension that runs through their history. A people born in war, pulled toward peace, and then dragged back into conflict when the wider galactic tides crash against their shores. Satine stands in a sunlit palace, arguing that Mandalore can be neutral, that the light side of the Force is not the only path to restraint. Bo-Katan turns away from her sister's pacifism, then spends years trying to repair the damage that choice unleashed. Din Djarin walks the ancient way, one quiet step at a time, proving that tradition can protect as well as divide. Far away, Sabine Wren paints her armor in bright colors, turning grief and rebellion into art, while Boba Fett wears his father's dented plates as a personal history of loss, survival, and reclaimed name. Behind them, Mandalore I and Tara Vizsla stand in the long shadow of memory, not as distant legends, but as the first links in a chain that has never truly broken. What followed was centuries of conquest, exile, and near extinction, yet the idea of being Mandalorian slipped through every crack. For thousands of years, empires have risen and fallen. Sith and Jedi have traded victories in the dark and the light, and still that helmet in the sand waits. Worlds are conquered, bombed, abandoned, clans are scattered, creeds are rewritten. But for the next 1,000 years, and the 1,000 after that, the thread continues in armor passed down, in words spoken over foundlings, in a simple choice to stand beside another under the same sky. Rise and fall, loss and return, each era a slow tide washing in and out, leaving behind one more helmet, one more story, and the quiet assurance that the Mandalorians endure. Drifting among the stars, letting the Mandalorian story settle. In the quiet that follows so many campaigns, armor is set aside and stories become softer at the edges. The story of the Mandalorians now drifts into that gentler space where sharp lines blur and only the broad shape of endurance remains. Names, dates, battles, all the markers of galactic history begin to loosen and fall away, as if carried off by a slow, patient wind moving across an empty plain. Over time, the exact year of each war matters less than the simple image of a helmet resting on a stone, watching the stars. The clash at Malachor 5 fades into a distant murmur. The Mandalorian Wars against the Jedi and the Republic reduced to a dim glow on the horizon of memory. The rise of Death Watch, the fall of pacifist Mandalore under Duchess Satine, the dark shadow of the Empire's purge, all become quiet constellations, far away and unthreatening. Their light remains, but their noise is gone. Across that dark sky, starfields stretch over silent battlefields. Once these places shook under the weight of walkers and starfighters, of Mandalorian Beskar meeting the blades of the Jedi and the Sith. Now, grass grows through fractured durasteel. Craters fill with still water that reflects 1,000 distant suns. The force that once roared here settles into a calm, steady hum, neither dark side nor light side, only rest. In the abandoned forges of Mandalore, the fires that shaped Beskar have cooled. Anvils stand untouched. Hammers lie where they fell. What followed was not another sudden war, but a long, slow exhale. Dust gathers on half-finished plates of armor, on sigils whose meanings only a few remember. The echo of metal on metal fades, replaced by the soft, almost inaudible sound of the planet turning, of time passing without conflict. Far from these halls, small ships move between quiet, forgotten worlds. Inside, a handful of Mandalorians sit in silence, wrapped in cloaks, armor dulled by years of travel. Outside, hyperspace flows in pale streaks, a gentle tunnel of light guiding them onward. For thousands of years, their path has twisted through victory and loss. Now it narrows to this simple motion through the dark, steady and unhurried. The story continues beyond any single telling, but every thread does not need to be followed. It is enough to know that somewhere a foundling is lifted in strong arms, that somewhere a vow is spoken under a calm sky, that somewhere a mask is removed in safety. Each breath drawn in and released is another small act of survival, another quiet declaration that the Mandalorians endure. As the galaxy grows dim and distant, the rhythm of the narration settles into something slow and even, a companion moving in step with a resting heartbeat. In and out, rise and fall, armor on, armor set aside. Complex histories reduced to simple truths. There is rest after war, there is safety after fear, and stories, once told, can always be returned to on another night. This is the way to sleep, soft closure, and next journeys. In the quiet that follows long remembrance, the story of the Mandalorians settles into a single image, a trail in the dust of Mandalore, footprints overlapping, fading, and continuing on into the dark horizon of galactic time. Power rose and fell, armor was forged and shattered, banners of empire and republic burned and vanished, yet the path remained, carried forward by new warriors who often never knew the names of those who walked before. Over time, the first Taung champions on Mandalore gave way to human clans, to crusaders under Mandalore the Ultimate, to wanderers haunted by the scars of the Mandalorian Wars against the Jedi and the Old Republic. What followed was an age of pacifist domes and fragile neutrality, when Duchess Satine tried to hold Mandalore apart from conflict and war, even as the Clone Wars raged just beyond the shields. Then came Deathwatch, the Darksaber, and the shadow of Sith ambition, pulling the planet back into the orbit of the dark side once more. For thousands of years, each era believed itself final, believed that this time the culture would be saved or lost forever. Yet the pattern endured. Mandalorians knelt to republics, defied empires, hid beneath the sands during the Great Purge and the Night of 1,000 Tears. And still, somewhere, a lone helmet waited on a starship bulkhead or beside a small campfire on an empty world. The story of this people was never just one leader or one creed, but a long, unbroken thread of choice, loyalty, and survival. Now, as the mind drifts, that thread can be set gently aside. The names of Tare Vizsla, Satine Kryze, and the scattered clans can blur at the edges, becoming distant constellations in a sky that no longer demands attention. Rest can take the place of chronology. Silence can take the place of battle. The Force, in its balance between dark side and light side, can hold these histories without effort, so that memory does not need to. Whenever sleep is difficult and the galaxy feels too loud, this path through Mandalorian history will still be here, waiting to be walked again from the ancient Taung to the distant descendants who whisper, "This is the way." Or another road can be taken instead, through the rise and fall of Sith, the patient watch of the Jedi, or the vast, slow turning of galactic empires and rebellions. A quiet suggestion only. Another calm chronicle can be set to play on some future night, or a simple subscription can keep these soft histories close, ready for the next time rest is needed. For now, there is nothing more required. No battle to follow, no final revelation that would change everything. No last stand to stay awake for. Only breathing, slow and steady. Only the gentle certainty that the Mandalorians endure, and their story will shape distant ages long after this night has passed. Rest now. The story will be here when waking returns. Rest now. The story will be here when waking returns. Rest now. The story will be here when waking returns.